Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Extend to Engage and Assess, presented by Christina Cavage. My name is James Marcita, and I'll be moderating this webinar at University Press. Before we get started, there are a couple of things I'd like to go over with you. If you look at the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a chat box. Looks like most of you have found this already. Use that chat box to do what you're doing, but also if you have any questions about the presentation, or if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, and we will get to you as soon as we can. Now, the PowerPoint for today's webinar will not be made available, but we are recording the webinar, and we'll send you a link to that recording the week after Thanksgiving, which is 2 weeks from now for our friends outside of the US. You can watch the recording as much as you like and pass it along to friends and colleagues who might find it interesting. You'll be able to see and hear everything that you see and hear right now. At the end of the webinar, which figures to run about 30 minutes, we will have a 15-minute question and answer period with Christina. Feel free to use that chat box once again during the question and answer period, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. We'll also make a certificate of attendance available to download during the question and answer period. Once you've downloaded that certificate, there's a space for you to write in your name. I think that's just about it for me, so without any further ado, I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Christina Cavage. Christina is currently Director of Intensive English Institute at Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, Florida. Prism Reading, published by Cambridge University Press. And last but not least, she's a fantastic presenter, as you will soon learn. All right, over to you, Christina.
Thank you, James. I'm so excited to see where you're all from. I love when you all post that. So some of you are experiencing some chilly weather. I see some of you from the Northeast there got a little snow. So let's get started with Extend to Engage and Assess. So as you know, this webinar is going to cover how Prism Reading can be used to engage learners deeper into the classroom, but also out of the classroom. And I'm going to show you how Prism Reading can meet your digital natives' needs and allow teachers to easily assess learning through engaging and collaborative task-based assessments. So you may have noticed, I think I used the word engage twice already. And before we look at our agenda and really dig deeper into this, let's start with me defining for you how I think of engagement. And we hear that term a lot today, and it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. But I'm going to work with the idea of engagement and that three approach to engagement. So I'm going to be talking about cognitive engagement. So how are your students investing in their learning? How are they developing in their learning? I'm going to talk about, and you can probably guess, this has a lot to do with participation in the classroom and even out of the classroom. And lastly, relational engagement. So how are they relating the content and the learning to outside of the classroom? So when I speak of engagement, I want my students to be cognitively engaged, behavioral engagement, and I want them to have relational engagement as well. So let's move on here and look at our agenda. What am I going to be covering? So I'm first going to talk about what makes our learners today unique, and they are unique. And how do they learn, and how is that different from maybe how some of us have learned? And how can you better engage this population? And again, thinking about those three levels of engagement. What are the 4 C's, and how can you effectively employ them with Prism? And then how can you assess tasks that engage and motivate? This is always a big challenge for many EAP instructors. So what makes our learners unique? Well, it's no surprise that our learners today are digital natives. They're part of this millennial generation. Technology is definitely the defining characteristic of this generation. They're connected to their world through technology, although they don't see it as technology. They just see it as part of their daily life. The average college student today between 18 and 24 owns about 7 devices. and 96% of this population actually sleep with their mobile devices. So again, a real value for this population. They have this need to be connected, but constantly connected. Some of us might even say over-connected. They want to receive content in a variety of ways. So they're used to having lots of media. And collaboration is a big part of their life. They are constantly collaborating through social networks, through Instagram, through Snapchat, and they want to be able to make those connections outside of the classroom as well. So when we think about today's learners, I think what makes them unique is that they're plugged in. They're plugged in 24/7. And I just love this little cartoon here where a baby's being born and, has to instantaneously text that out. So I love this quote as well. You see the way they interact with various media. They use their phones differently. To them, email is old school. They use the phone to text incessantly, surf the web, find directions, take pictures, make videos, and collaborate. So when we think about teaching, and specifically teaching language, what's really changed? Well, the population has changed, and their learner's journey has changed. And what do I mean by their learner's journey? What are they bringing to the classroom? That has changed. And how they learn has changed. So we're moving in this direction, and it's also a change for those of us who are not digital natives in the way in which we teach. So we're moving from this academic approach of providing content and even, having a little bit more of what we would call control over our classroom, to really empowering and facilitating collaboration and social interactions. And with this, we need to bring in technology, but not just trivial uses of technology, but true applications that will increase learning. So I mentioned that they learn differently. These students have actually been rewired. There's lots of research out there, and I'm going to share with you some of my sources. Doctors have studied their brains and find that their brains are actually physically changed. They're different from ours. And this is a result of how they grew up. They definitely have different thinking patterns. Thinking patterns of young people, college-age students today, are not very linear, where most of us, 20, 30 years ago in school, very linear processes. So they live in this, real sheer volume of interaction, this constant processing. And we have to realize that they learn differently. And so this might require us to teach differently. So how can we better engage these learners? How can we build that cognitive engagement, that behavioral engagement, and that relational engagement? Well, there's 4 methods which I have found to be quite successful in building these. First of all, we have the concept of microlearning. So you may not know that term, but you're probably familiar with YouTube or Khan Academy. These are all built on the concept of microlearning, learning in small pieces. And we're going to see some examples of this in a minute. The second is really exposing students to rich, high interest themes and content. We know the richer the content is, the more engaged the students are. We also have to create opportunities for that social collaborative environment, thinking about who our population is today, what their expectations are, what that learning journey has been for them. And then authentic assessments beyond traditional means. And the 2-prong approach of those authentic assessments. So microlearning. Microlearning is learning in small, digestible pieces, okay? And I've recently read that it's often called now bus stop learning or mobile snacking, which I just find really interesting, mobile snacking. So students today to respond to these nano-sized bits of content. Again, going back to how their brains are wired today. They want to learn in these small, digestible pieces. So short videos like this one, 2 minutes max, is a really effective way to meet this type of learning. But microlearning, it has so many advantages and definitely meets the needs of digital learners. It's really applicable to English language learners because it's not just about these small chunks of learning, it's about the repetition and the ability for repetition. So we can only get this content perhaps delivered in a format, in a digital format, right? So having students having access to a learning management system where they can access this content and it's readily and easily available. So they're engaging at a cognitive level outside the classroom as well. Next, we have our rich, high interest themes and content. So, finding ways to immerse learners in content is really critical. And we can only do this with very high interest, rich themes. And gone are the days of looking at these traditional themes like history and science. And if you open up any textbook today, ESL textbook, you're rarely going to find themes like that. We need now to look at topics like globalization, social justice and awareness, entrepreneurial literacy, and environmental literacy. It must be relevant to the learners. And just think about who our learners are. They just click when they're bored. They go right to the next one. And we don't want them, using that forward arrow to move on. We want them to feel connected. And interestingly enough, research tells us that if the theme is high interest, students actually perceive the content to be easier than if they're not interested in the content. And they also rate the activities as highly useful activities if they're engaged in the content. Now, some of those activities may not even be highly useful, but because of that level of engagement, that is their view. They view it as easier and they view it as useful. And I'll share that research with you at the end. So social collaborative tasks are really very important. As I said earlier, this is a sharing population, right? They want everything out there. They want to constantly collaborate. So they thrive in this kind of environment. And we need to make sure that we're building in activities that allow students to collaborate because we know this collaboration leads to greater success and obviously increased learning, which is our goal. So if we can incorporate tasks like this, so if we look at this is the old Spotify logo with the new Spotify logo. This was in a reading, and then students are asked to collaborate, brainstorm 3 logos that they don't think are attractive. They're going to redesign one of the logos. They're going to present the redesign. So you can see on the level here of all the cognitive skills that can those behavioral engagement that's happening. And relational engagement. This is content they can take and apply it to a different situation. And they're highly connected to it. Because it is a high interest topic for many of our learners. They know icons more than they know anything else, right? So I'm also going to hit on this authentic, non-traditional assessment. So it may seem a bit counterintuitive that authentic assessment be non-traditional, but what I'm advocating for here are assessments that allow students to demonstrate their language skills beyond the traditional drill and kill type of assessment. And we have to think about the kinds of tasks our students will be doing when they leave our EAP or ESL programs. It's not going to be drill and kill. They're going to need to read something and apply that reading. So here's a critical thinking task. Students had to read 2 different readings. They had to move up Bloom's taxonomy with apply, analyze, evaluate. But you can see how, as a teacher, you could assess this beyond the traditional, what are the main ideas? What are the supporting ideas? What's an example? So really, students being able to use that content in another setting really is a very powerful assessment. And we'll look at assessment again in a bit. So how does Prism do this? And you've already seen a few images, but we're going to dig into this a little deeper. So essentially, microlearning, rich themes, collaboration, and authentic assessments are really the path and build the path to better learning. Really follows a 21st century approach to teaching and learning. And this 21st century approach, many of you may be familiar with, it's called the 4C approach. So communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity. That's really the path to better learning, making sure we're building all of these things into our courses. So let's look at it with Prism Reading. Now, if you're not familiar with Prism Reading, it is a 5-level EAP reading course. It fosters communication, and we're going to see that in a minute. It embraces and takes advantage of learners' desires for collaboration. We saw a few of those collaborative tasks already. I'll talk about how they're built in throughout the unit. And it builds critical thinking skills by moving up Bloom's taxonomy. You saw a piece of that already, but I'll talk a little deeper about that in a minute. And it cultivates creativity. Now, we don't always think about creativity in an ESL class, in an EAP class, but I'm going to give you a definition of creativity that might have you rethinking building creativity in our classes. So the 4 C's, let's start with communication here. Good communication skills are necessary for, but especially our English language learners. They need to be able to engage in class discussions, debates, and presentations when they leave our classrooms, right? On-the-spot sharing is a pillar in higher education today. So if our students are moving into academic disciplines, we need to prepare them for that on-the-spot sharing. And so, the skill isn't developed solely in our listening and speaking classes, but really across the board. It needs to be integrated. Our students need to be able to read and communicate the meaning of that content, but more importantly, how that content can be applied to other situations. And we have to keep in mind that in an EAP, in an ESL course, content is only a vehicle to develop linguistic and academic skills. Our intended outcome is always communication, whether it's received or given. So when we look at Prism, we can see how it lends itself to fostering and building communicative competence among our students through vocabulary development, real-life text, and synthesis. So like most texts, every unit begins with an activate your knowledge. So these are opportunities for students to communicate with one another in pretty traditional ways to build communication, build some background knowledge. But communication and building communicative competence goes beyond just creating opportunities for students to communicate with one another. But they also need to make good choices about what and how they communicate. So take a look at this very simple vocabulary exercise, and I believe it's from level 1. So this is teaching students really connotations, cultural meanings that are associated with very simple vocabulary words. Now, if our students would look some of these words up in the able to get that cultural meaning. So building some communicative competence from the very beginning, showing students that they not only need to make the choose, know the meaning of the word, but they need to make the right choice for the situation. That's really what building communicative competence is all about. Our next C is collaboration. And we know, as I've told you, this population thrives in a collaborative environment. And many of our students want to move into university courses, and they will find that working collaboratively is a key to success in higher education. Some of my best students move on, and the only complaint I hear is, oh, they're not great in group work. They don't participate freely in class, and we don't want to hear those things about our students. So we're often really focused on building those cognitive domains, remembering, understanding, applying, and these are oh so critical for academic success. But we can't forget that our students need to be able to integrate themselves into teams or groups. And many of these students they're working with might have very different perspectives from themselves. And so working collaboratively in a team or a group brings a whole different set of skills that we need to nurture and build in the classroom. Things from negotiating to showing respect to hearing others' values and questioning. It's all part of those affective domains. And so to build those affective domains, we have to make sure that they're engaged in that behavioral sense, right, with participation. And for this digital generation, it's especially critical. So there has to be explicit instruction in building those affective domains. So if we take a look at this collaborative task, and these collaborative tasks appear 3 in a unit. So there's one after each reading and then one after the short video segment. So 3 total in a unit. And they can even be expanded into the digital environment, which I'll show you in a minute. So looking at this task, they have to work in a group. They have to make a list of 10 things that you, the government, and or corporations can do to reduce global warming and slow climate change. They're going to put them in order. They're going to rank them. So you can imagine the amount of negotiation that has to happen here. Again, collaboration, but also building those affective domains. And it's interesting because in Prism 4, there's even an entire unit on the concept of collaboration and how prevalent it is in our society today. So collaboration, as I mentioned, could even be expanded into the digital environment. Remember, this is the language this population speaks. They want to be connected beyond the classroom as well. And so here is a wiki. So we were talking about environmental problems. I'm asking students just to add environmental problems that exist in their own country. It's an opportunity for students to continue that dialogue after class is over. Blogs are another great way for that to happen. Thinking. So we discussed affective domains, but how about those cognitive domains? We know students today need critical thinking skills, and we need to thoughtfully move them from remembering to creating. And Prism does this. It moves students up the taxonomy and actually calls it out for teachers. Because again, EAP instruction is just not about rote memorization, right? We need our students to take those linguistic skills and apply them in diverse areas. And again, not done without explicit practice. So take a look at this activity after a reading and the traditional types of exercises we see, identifying main ideas, details. Students are then asked to think critically about the text. And not only asked to think critically, but we can see them actually moving up the taxonomy here. So some tasks might deal with remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and perhaps even creating. And in a lot of other reading texts, we really just focus on that remembering and understanding. We might hit evaluate sometimes, but here we are again thoughtfully moving up the taxonomy. So we're moving up the taxonomy without having students just create on their own. Moving up that taxonomy, scaffolding the instruction for them. and creativity, one of my favorites. So we generally don't think about building or fostering one's creativity in EAP, but in today's world, it's a really necessary skill. So let me define what I mean by creativity. I really like Brian Clark's definition of creativity. Creativity is seeing the interaction of seemingly unrelated topics and combining them into something new. So isn't that what we're really doing in our EAP courses? Aren't we constantly asking students to take this language and to form it into something new, something creative for themselves? And from where many of our students come from, creativity was never fostered or explicitly worked on. So these collaborative tasks, again, build creativity. And we know when students are more creative, they're more motivated. When students are more motivated, more learning occurs. So what about assessment? What role does this play? Well, digital learners like instant gratification, right? Immediacy is a huge value for this population. I'm sure you've had some of the exact same experiences I've had. If you don't hand back something right away, students are like, do you have it? They're just used to that instant gratification. They also thrive in a polyfocal environment, one that's social and there's a lot of shared knowledge. So I really suggest a two-prong approach to assessment. One, using a digital tool. A learning management system can provide that instant gratification for our students, but it also can inform us of our students' strengths and weaknesses. So this was a student over the summer, and you can see this particular chapter. She had 100 on the reading, she had 100 on the key vocabulary, 76 on language development. So it gave her instant feedback, but it also informed me as a teacher. Maybe I need to cover that language development section a little deeper in my class. The second part of assessment that I'm advocating for is really project-based learning or task-based learning. And essentially, that's what these collaborative tasks are or could easily become. Many of them can be done within the classroom, while others might need extended periods of time for students to work together. So this is really a very effective way to assess students, but it's also a very realistic way to assess students, because this is how they'll be assessed beyond our EAP courses. And it's really motivating for our students to get more of a holistic picture of their skill set. So let's be honest, when they're in their content courses, they'll not generally be asked for these drill and kill kinds of exercises, but real world applications. So this one, after some reading and some watching of a video, students do research and they work in a group to do the research. They create some kind of visual. They share their visual, their infographic with the class. Again, speaking the language of this population. Some other really effective task-based projects are design challenges. This is a bit of a design challenge. Creating public service announcements. Students love those. Generating surveys, aggregating surveys. And you will find many of those collaborative tasks within Prism Reading. So learning to negotiate, research, developing those 21st century skills is one of the greatest outcomes of project-based collaborative learning. And it's a real meaningful assessment for learners. So in summary here, today's learners are digital learners. They are wired differently. Their expectation of the classroom is different than students 10 or 15 years ago. It's critical to adopt pedagogies that can motivate and engage these learners deeply. And remember, we want to engage them in a cognitive manner, behavioral, and relational. When they're engaged in these three manners, they're building upon those 4 C's: collaboration, creativity, communication, and critical thinking. So I have some of the sources here for you, and I understand the webinar will be shared with you, so you'll have access to those sources. And I want to thank you very much for your time. And let's see if you have any questions, comments, or thoughts. You can just type them right in the chat box if you do have a question.
That's right. You can send your questions to Christina via that chat box. And also, you may have noticed I just pulled the certificate of attendance into the room. So if you click on the name of the certificate and then click on download file, you'll have that certificate available to you.
Can I put the list of resources back up? Absolutely. There you go. What kinds of activities are on the digital component for the online workbook for Prism Reading? So you have activities, some are media based, so you may have a bit of audio, video. Some are your traditional kinds of activities. But there's a lot you can do with your students as far as the blogs, the wikis, discussion groups. So very similar if you're using like a Blackboard or a Canvas and you have that ability to have class discussions, announcements, wikis, blogs. How would this work for very low literacy level students? And yes, there is a pre-level Prism intro, and I think that is actually the point where you should start using tools like this. Students at that level understanding how to move up Bloom's taxonomy, but also how to collaborate. So, you know, while you're starting out with those early language skills, you're building cognitive skills, but you're also building those affective skills that are so important for students beyond EAP courses. And obviously the content is scaffolded, the language is scaffolded. So I find that the early users are more receptive, or the early learners are more receptive to these kinds of tasks because it's all new for them. So James, there's a question about the webinar being recorded and access to the recording later on. So the webinar is being recorded. It's being posted on Instagram. Once it's ready, the week after Thanksgiving, you'll get an email with the link. Oh, posting it to YouTube, not Instagram. Got it.
Yeah, sorry about that. Quick typo. But yes, we recorded the webinar and it will be up on YouTube, and the recording link will be sent to whichever email address that you registered for the webinar with. And someone had a question about unsupported content when downloading the certificate. It's a PDF, so if you have a PDF reader, you should be able to open it.
So there's a question about getting some samples of the material. James, do you want to take that question about samples? There are sample chapters up on the.
Yeah, I can hop in here. So if you want a sample, you should request it through your ESL specialist. You'll have a local ESL specialist. And I'm actually going to our website right now to, I'm going to post the link in the chat where you can figure out who your local ESL specialist is. So just give me 1 minute and I'll come back with that link.
Okay, so I see some notes about the certificates. There's the link. Yes, there is research about how brains in the younger generation have changed. So you want to look at Mark Prensky's research. He is the third resource there. He quotes some doctors from Baylor University. So it's very, very interesting. He's actually the gentleman who coined the phrase digital natives and digital immigrants. So I'm not seeing too many more questions.
All right, guys, I think that is all the time we have for today's webinar. I want to thank you all very much for attending the webinar, and I hope you liked it. I want to thank Christina once again for a wonderful presentation. Like I said, we will be sending out the link to the recording, and that email will also have a link to the certificate. That'll come the week after Thanksgiving, so early, about 2 weeks from now. And that's it for us today from Cambridge University Press. Just want to thank you all for attending one more time and to thank Christina one more time.